Okay, it's a bit quiet.
Did you see this? The white monsters have ghosts from them. Oh, we do. Are you sure this is real?
Yes. This is solid. I saw the house.
Hello and welcome to Behind the Animation Hair with Minty Root. You'll never guess, I'm Minty Root. So you might recognize some of my work, although not on those movies that I did work on as a 3D environment artist, or those two as a QC generalist, or lots of work that's under NDA, unfortunately. But stay tuned, there's a lot of things I'm very excited to talk about. And of course, a couple of, I think they were good. At least my mom thinks they were good. I found it quite interesting because my career path has been really weird. I wanted to go into engineering. I ended up with a path working in VFX and movies, and COVID happened, and the opportunity to work in animated productions just to fix mistakes left by the animation crew happened. And I discovered the work of QC generalists, who basically, think of it, you can think of generalists as a jack of all trades, who basically have a bit of knowledge on everything in the animation pipeline, which is incredible when you need to fix mistakes for movies, because you need to know a bit of everything. So, for example, and that's the funniest thing, one of the promotional images for the movie that I worked on that ended up being canceled is one where they left mistakes there, and I don't need to explain what's wrong. Our task was to make sure that the characters wouldn't pass through each other, that the clothes wouldn't explode in all the directions, making sure that we would collaborate between different departments to make sure that everything would just work together. And the idea for us was to try to avoid animation errors as much as possible, which is quite interesting because the one thing that inspired me to join in the animation industry was the curiosity I got because of one specific animation error that I'll be able to talk about later. But animation errors with the show, with the franchise have not been uncommon. We've had cases of alicorns back in the 80s. So it's not something that's new to G4. It's and I like to just explore a bit why animation errors happen. You think, well, if we can catch it as a fandom, couldn't people at DHX catch it as well? But just to give you a good sheer idea of the scale of the series. So here's just the opening sequence for The Return of Harmony Part 1. So each of those is an individual shot, and the whole idea is that you make sequences out of shots because you cut between cameras, and each one of them just for about a minute and a half. That's quite a lot. It's so just to give you a good idea, that means 21 shots, a minute and 20 seconds. One shot every 3.5 3.8 seconds, which isn't uncommon. So it's very common with the movie industry that you have quicker and quicker shots in movies that feels very disorienting. But with animation, you can get away with it a lot because you have something that's much easier to read visually. But just to get the good idea of the kind of scale that means, so one episode, if you assume that has about roughly 320 shots, that in one season has 26 episodes, let's do the math real quick. That's 8,320 shots per season. And as we know, they usually go with one season per year. And let's exclude season 3 because that was an oddity. But to give you a good idea, that's 33 shots per day to get to just basically just say that's good. Let's go with it. 33 shots per day with a studio with because you have most of the artists. Hopefully, they only work 8 hours a day. So just the amount of things that you have to make sure that you just get right, and that's just excluding all the other work that just goes into making the animation, making the backgrounds, syncing the lip sync, getting the in-betweens right, all of those elements. And you also have to check for the animation errors, and you don't really, sometimes you might have budget for someone who's just in charge of just fixing the animation errors, but as we know, the budget of the show was pretty tiny for when you compare with other studios. So the thing that we have to consider is that the iceberg of all the animation errors that we catch and all the animation errors that they catch is quite incredible. And one of the most famous animation errors, although I say animation errors, but the way that Jason described it, if you look, actually, if you look closely, you see Derpy Hooves who's there, and she became an icon instantly. But the way that he implies it and the way that he wrote the post implies that it's less of an error and more of like a little goof that one of the animators decided to add in, because as I understood it, the way that they wanted to frame the shot originally was more like this. And the whole idea is the animator thought, well, nobody's going to see it because it's out of frame, why not just mess up with the eyes of one of the characters? Which might also explain why another error just happened right after. Like, Derpy Hooves got plushies, became an icon, got lots of fan art, fan songs, fan creations. Grey Lip Lemon Heart had nothing, and she's right there. It's quite iconic because, and it's also very ironic because when I redid the scene for Missing Out, of course I had to bring back Derpy, and of course not Grey Heart, Lemon Heart, because no. But you might see that I also accidentally introduced another animation error. Do you catch it? No? Okay. That's not Starlight's eye color. And you think, well, it fits the stripe in her mane, that fits very well. Why did I make the mistake? Like, usually when I create the rig and I make sure that everything just lines up, what would have caused it? And then eventually, unfortunately I didn't catch it until the release of the project. It just dawned on me. Since the rig for Starlight Glimmer was based on the Sunset Shimmer rig from the Fall Sunset Shimmer, it somehow synced up with the previous color that the rig had. So I had Sunset's colors for some reason. And animation errors with the show have been quite common. For example, one of the good examples, sometimes you'd have characters missing their heads. And I would like to do a little demonstration really quick. Actually, I forgot to start Flash, so I will do it live with you, just to give you a good idea of how weird it is. Oh, need a seat. Yeah, no, that kind of animation error is a bit different. So I hope it's not going to open in the wrong window. Okay, it's loading. Yeah, a big part of the animation industry is just waiting for software to load. It's a good excuse to give yourself a reason to go out, grab a coffee, return, it started, then you get to work. And of course, you get to talk with someone who's has a desk right next to you. Okay, so let's open this rig. And I'm gonna have to do it blind because it's not the same display on this computer and this computer. So we have Derpy Who's over there, and the whole idea is that you have all the 360 for character. Actually, I'm really doing it blind. So the whole idea is that you there we go. I just demonstrated one of the reasons why that kind of animation error is going to happen sometimes. Sometimes they're going to have something that's just out of sync because the way that you have all the symbols, like right there, some of those just don't sync up properly. So let's go and let's Control Z that. So you go with this. And there. I did it. There we go. I think I should click. Do not see what I'm doing. There. There we go. And then you get to sync up with the head inside. The whole idea is that the head has its own symbol because it's much easier. For example, if you have a character who's just talking, just do the animation of the talking inside the head and then you put it on the body. And then, for example, if you have a character who's walking, you can just have the head that's just walking while they're just talking while the walking is happening outside. And it makes it so much easier. There's also a trick that the animation team does do a lot, is that whenever the characters are walking, it's always the same walk cycle that you reuse. It's a 24 frame cycle and 24 frames per second, which means that they always walk at the same speed, which is just 2 steps per second. But there we go. So you have the head for Derpy. I wish I thought of going with a cheerleader rig just to fit it, but I think it fits well to have Derpy. So one of the things, for example, is that let's say that I'm just gonna extend the frames for this, and let's say I insert frames. There we go. And you can see right away what's the problem. Because as I did it very quickly, I didn't check it to see if the frames below were also extended. And one of the problems is that the way that usually what you do if you want to just get rid of an element in a specific frame is that you have empty keyframes like this. And it basically just goes from one to the other. And for example, and of course you can create a whole different keyframe for like this. And basically the keyframe is going to be a separate element. So as the timeline keeps going and switches between the two. And the problem is that it doesn't really know what to do if you have nothing underneath. And sometimes you don't catch it because you're going to have so many layers for those rigs, sometimes upwards of 40. So just not being able to catch it right away is not. Sometimes it's not going to happen. Sometimes it's going to be just that the animation extends past a very certain point, and you only. And unfortunately, I'm very guilty of it. Just checking the beginning of the shot as the animation goes, just to see if everything goes well, and I don't check the very end. And sometimes you don't because you expect the shot to just cut a bit too early. And it happens with a lot of situations. For example, if you go back to so for example, if you go back to this one, it's kind of the same thing. Where in this specific case, it's not that they missed a couple of the parts, it's that they squished a view from the front and a view from the side together, just by copying one of the poses from one of the side views and one of the pose from the front view. And of course, you also don't catch that. What was this one? Oh yeah, if you look at the bluish gray stallion in the middle, you look at his outlines, they're actually brown. I think they're a bit hard to see on this projector, but trust me, it's really that stupid. So, sometimes the whole reason in the specific case is that he's a recolor of Doctor Hooves, and what you do whenever you do that kind of recolor is that you do Control F. Is basically the same thing as Control F when you do you change text. The whole idea is that you change a single specific color, and somehow they forgot to also change the color of the outline. Sometimes you're going to have something very, very simple, just layering issues, which is a very good reason, and I'm talking to everybody, like I'm also very guilty of that, but name your layers. Sometimes you have a very, very, very emotional scene where you have two characters. It's nice. They finally get back to talking to each other. They have lots of emotions to deal with. It's a very important scene, right? They don't have legs. And I find it kind of funny because the crew of the show did discuss this specific animation error, and I have a clip I want to show you. Let's see. Oh, sorry. So, biggest mistake, me dressing up like that at that panel, worst outfit ever. But this is a good idea of what one of the things that also happen. Revisions happen to change a couple of things, and usually what the animators will try to do is to try to lock their shots to the bare minimums that they need to do for that shot, because with the budget that they have, they wouldn't want to animate stuff that it's outside of the frame if they're not going to see it, and then revisions happen that need to affect it. You'll see it a lot in VFX-heavy movies that also happen to have lots of revisions, where they're going to try to make the VFX to work with one shot, and then the director will ask, like, can I have a specific angle? And then they'll have to redo everything to fit that angle. And sometimes they won't have a lot of time, so lots of mistakes will happen. Sometimes the lighting will be off, sometimes the animation will be off. Lots of it just comes down to revisions, changing things in post like that. Let's go back to there we go. Sometimes you'll have things while talking about revisions. For example, in Lunar Eclipse, the idea is that they wanted to change the design for Luna right away. Instead of going back with the design they had in season 1, I would assume that they thought that having her show up with a completely different design for Candlelight Wedding would be jarring. And they probably thought, like, let's go with a new design right now because it feels more character accurate. One of the problems is that when you have to change all the pieces of an asset to make it look different, while it has already been animated, sometimes bits of the old design shows up. Sometimes you'll have, for example, you're going to have characters, basically you build a rig out of another character and you don't account for one tiny mistake. Sometimes you'll forget that for one frame you have a character just walking back and the cutie mark of the original rig just shows up. Because they never accounted for it, and sometimes it happens. Although some people ended up speculating, having all the sorts of fan theories about it. I remember back in the early days of fandom, some people were saying like, we never see Rainbow Dash in the same shot as her, so could she be some kind of alternative persona? And I find it pretty funny. Sometimes it's very, very simple things. For example, just in this one, do you see it? Little gap in her mane here in the neck. And you don't catch it right away, so as the character move and keep going, sometimes you'll have things that just show up for a couple of frames, and sometimes you don't catch it. But the thing is that we're very, very good at catching the things that they didn't want us to catch. So sometimes you'll have a frame from the. So one of the things is that the way that you have the cycle is that you have the way that the flash rigs for the show work is that you have the animation, and then at the end of the timeline you have all the frames of the 360. In the way that I did mine, I decided to do it at the very beginning. But the thing is that once the animation is done, it goes back and then it just fits the next frame that's right in the timeline. And sometimes you'll hit back on that cycle, so you have characters just spinning their head like this one. Sometimes it's not that the timeline ends, but you have the symbol that's set as loop, so it goes back to the first frame, and sometimes the head at the first frame has nothing to do with it. That's why I really recommend to double check to see if it's at play once or loop. But one of the things is that kind of animation error also usually happens not with the beauty shot, but the more mundane shots that you don't really expect. Because, for example, whenever they had to do the crystal ponies, they had to split the layers of the characters and then recombine them in After Effects to add the glows, the crystal effect, the weird masking. You can't really do that in Flash. So you think, is it just due to Flash being weird and having that kind of issue, and you really catch it only when you have to get around other software to continue the animation? Because Flash, in their specific case, they use a very, very old version from 2004. You'd think, is it clunky because it's old? No, it still happens with modern software, i.e., although this one's not really an error. Well, you can define it as an error. There's different ways to look at it. Someone from the cast of Make Your Mark decided to actually cover the whole thing, and to sum it up, the client wanted this specific main, and they said, well, we're doing it as the client asked, so we're getting rid of the ears. And what they did is that they didn't get rid of the ear on the model. They basically just flipped it to be inside the pony rig. It created a lot of memes. And cursed ones, and sometimes wholesome ones. So you know what the youth really likes doing? He really likes showing their hoofs. Like, look at my hoof, how pretty it is. No, this one's mostly due to the way that they do compositing, because So one of the things with 3D is that since 3D elements take a while to render, one of the things you want to do is to split the elements in separate layers and then recombine them. The problem is that when you recombine them, it tends to look a bit like this. I know that VFX and CG studios really want to have very specific pipeline for how they arrange their nodes to avoid that kind of mistake, but sometimes mistakes happen. One of the things too is that sometimes you're going to have just one of those pointing to a different file, and the location of the file is just the wrong one sometimes, because it's weirdly complex computer things, and some artists are not the best with that. And sometimes it's just that they don't catch it because it's a TV pipeline. So you have to do a whole season of television with the budget that they would have for just one movie. And the MLP movie was about 90 minutes long, while you have a whole season that's a couple of hours. So just having to do all of that and trying to catch those mistakes, and sometimes you look back at the shot and you're thinking, well, maybe she's just showing like, look how pretty my hoof is. Because sometimes you're going to have animators who don't get to have context because they don't have the sound on. Unfortunately, some productions we don't really get to have a full view of the whole project ahead of time to have a bit more context. It really depends on the production. It's due to usually scheduling. Sometimes you'll have very tight productions because the client really wants it very soon. So the animators don't really have the time to be briefed. And one of the problems too with that kind of studio is the communication, because you have lots of animators need to communicate back and forth. And you need to communicate back and forth, and sometimes you'll have animators who are very busy, so they don't have the time to communicate back. Sometimes it's just that the way that you communicate it, there's some problems with the communication, and things get lost. Sometimes it has happened to me a couple of times. I was told like, can you do it that way? And the way that was explained it, I did it the way I understood it, and I just did it wrong. And that happens in life. That's one of the things. I'm really glad I'm just doing animation where the mistakes happen, but it doesn't crash planes. Sometimes you'll have in this this looks very off-putting. When they tell you, yeah, you should exfoliate. So the main way it works is that those characters have a slight layer of fur. Like it's very, very simple. It's mostly just a shell that has a bit of an outer edge that has a bit of an alpha. But the thing is that you still need to bake that fur. Basically, baking, the idea is that you have something that's completely generated by, for example, the animation is done by bones, and those bones are animated by animators, but you have to have the shell that follows it. And sometimes the shell doesn't follow it right away. You need to pre-calculate it because of that. And sometimes you forget to pre-calculate it, or you have a bug where it just stops at one frame, and instead of just not showing you anything for the frame after, it just keeps showing you the things from the frame before. So it might just be a displaced frame from earlier in the animation. Or I'll show a bit later one of the other examples that could do that. Sometimes you'll have things like this. You could think, well, what's the error? And that's quite funny because I kept catching it at Maker Mark because that's the kind of mistake I was paid to actually fix in productions. You can see that the eyelash is clipping through her eye. It looks very painful. It looks very painful because it happens all the time. And trying to fix it for the animation, it's quite a lot. It's very complex. Sometimes it just happens during a blink. So, it's a blink and you miss it situation. So with the budget that they had, they wouldn't bother just fixing that. It wouldn't really make the animation that much better. Sometimes you'd have things, in this specific case, you'll have, it's kind of hard to see in a projector, but you're going to see that there's a bit of an edge that's smudged between the hoof and the background behind, and it's mostly just due to the way that you do motion blur. The idea is that what they do with motion blur is that you calculate a motion vector of the direction something works when it moves, and then you just tell in comp blur in that direction. And the problem is sometimes you're going to have the hoof on the same layer as the background, so it's going to blur the background behind. But I was thinking, I want a good example of one of the limitations of that motion blur approach, because unlike what they had for the movie, they couldn't really afford that kind of rendering time, because motion blur means that you're going to have to render a lot more samples, because you're basically scattering the object between the two frames in the amount of motion blur you'd have with just that frame time. But the thing I wanted to also cover is just that if you look at the corner here, you're going to have a very weirdly blurry rock, and you're thinking, why did it happen? And one of the speculations with that is that animators don't really work with what you see on the screen. What they're going to usually work is a black and white view of the model with no textures, no lighting. And sometimes you won't even have subdivisions, which I'll cover later. And with that, unfortunately, what that means is that the animator or the layout artist won't be able to catch it. It's going to go back to lighting that has to basically just look at placing all the lights in the scene and then looking at if the render looks good. And one of the problems that if the lighting artist catches a mistake, sometimes the lighting artist might be able to change the model or just give a call to basically tell the department, like, this model is very low res, can we substitute it or send the guy res? But the back and forth between the two departments is going to take a while. Sometimes you'll have to go back to the animation department if the model is slightly different. Sometimes you'll catch some things, for example, if you look at this one. So there's two things I wanted to cover, and I'll cover the first one first. The reflection doesn't match. Not only that, the reflection doesn't match, but the shadow on the ground doesn't match. And one of the speculations is they actually changed the animation for Sunny as they realized that the hoof needed to be slightly different position because it read a bit weird on screen. But they already rendered the background plate and they realized that the background plate would have a reflection in the ground. And unfortunately, due to the way that Arnold and a couple of other renderers work, they actually treat the reflection part of the model that reflects it rather than the model that causes a reflection. So, and they probably didn't catch it because they didn't think that it would be a reflective surface. So sometimes you catch those mistakes. But the one reason why I want to cover that one was that if you look, do you see those very, very jagged edges? We're not in the PlayStation 2 era. Like, not only that, but since the show is already pre-rendered, you don't have to render it all the time like a video game. You can afford to actually have more polygons. So why did they have that here? My best guess is that they didn't catch the subdivision level. And unfortunately, they probably assumed that the background would be more blurred to hide it. And you have the opposite problem when you actually enable the subdivision because now you have a gap. And all of it comes down to the approach that you have whenever you do 3D models that have round edges with animated shows. It's called Catmull-Clark subdivision. The whole idea is that what you do is that you interpolate between positions of polygons to have a rounder edge. And the whole idea is that you have less polygons that you have to actually model, and then you just assume by just interpolating those in a specific manner. So you get something that looks like this and then just turns into this because of subdivisions. And it's quite funny because Catmull-Clark subdivisions have been a thing since the 70s. They called it recursively generated B-spline surfaces on arbitrary topological meshes by Ed Catmull and Jim Clark. And, it's quite a mouthful. You're thinking, okay, it's not going to be that much. Ed Catmull, he ended up working on a couple of things. He ended up founding a little company, being co-founder of a little company called Pixar. But it's 3D is quite a lot. You're gonna think, what about tell your tale? And sometimes they'll do in this specific case. It's more, it's not technical mistakes. It's more contextual mistakes. For example, this one. Do you catch it? It's very adorable. Why would she have a rainbow in her mane at that point? And from what I've understood, if I look at the pieces, the shapes of the piece, it looks like what they did is that they just took the mane that they had for the adult rig and they just scaled it back to the filly rig, which makes sense because if it's a flashback for a scene that will only happen once and you'll never need it again, sometimes you'll do something quick. And sometimes the animators who work on it won't always know all the specifics because, for example, this short, I don't know if this short was made before the release of the movie or after, but sometimes you'll have the animators who don't have the time to actually watch it or they were not briefed on the subject. And then you wonder, did the 3D show have that mistake? And no, they didn't. But in this specific case, it's probably because they just repurposed the model that they had from the movie. Sometimes you'll have more weird problems. For example, if you look at the finale, it's kind of a spoiler, but also not for the finale of Make Your Mark. Well, finale like right before Starlight, Secret of Starlight. So, if, for example, if you look at the bridge that you had for Pauline's castle, and the whole reason why it's set like that is that the one that you look at on the shot on the left is a 3D model, while the one on the right is simply a matte painting. The whole idea, from what I understand, is that they just made a matte painting because they just expected it to be an establishing shot. So they needed to make a 3D model really quickly of the tree for that one scene, and I assume that they ended up just assuming that there was probably not enough overlap in communication between two departments, which is a mistake that happens. So, in conclusion, do I have... Okay, I talk a bit faster than I was expecting. Q&A? Do you have any questions you want to ask about the animation of the series? Do you want me to cover? Yeah?
So I was wondering about that scene you mentioned with Derby where the animator put the eyes like that because they didn't expect it to be actually in the scene. I was wondering, why bother messing with the eyes at all if you know it's not going to be in the scene?
Sometimes animators get bored. Yeah?
How much like effort or like money is like usually put into error checking, specifically?
It's hard to tell. It really depends from studio to studio. Last time I was doing that kind of error checking for movies, we had the tiny team, like maybe 8 people, and it really depends on the kind of production we can have. For FIM, from what I've understood, they didn't have a specific department for mistakes. It was mostly just some of the crew just working on that on the side, and I assume that not having the specific department for that probably didn't help. And I assume they couldn't hire just a department just for that because they didn't have the budget. If I recall I think they had around $120,000 to $140,000 per episode, which is really tiny in terms of animation for that. I think it was closer to $300,000. So just having that tiny of a budget and still trying to do something interesting out of it, my best guess is that they assumed that the mistakes would be something that would happen, and they would rather have something that doesn't play it safe with that kind of mistake, but still goes with something more ambitious. For example, if you look at like season 4, the fight scene with Terek, if they tried to play it safe by trying to fix all their mistakes, could they have had the budget to be able to pull that off? And I do wonder, because as a fandom we're pretty forgiving, and lots of audiences are very forgiving, and I do wonder if not worrying too much about that helped the show in the long run. Yeah?
That's not computer animated, but what about G1? Are there G1 animation errors?
G1 is quite interesting. The errors probably come down to the fact, one of the things is that a lot of it was outsourced. For example, the G1 movie was done by Toei Animation in, I think, another animation studio. I want to say Akon. And the whole idea is that they had 2 separate studios overseas, and they had about 16 weeks to do the whole thing. I'm quite impressed that they didn't do more animation errors. I think they played it more safe, because if you compare, like they did the movie around the same time as the G1 Transformers movie and the G.I. Joe movie. They basically did a 3-picture deal that where all 3 flopped, in part because they released it at the worst time. But the whole thing is that they had about 16 weeks to do those movies and it's quite interesting. The movie had just a pipeline for TV. So if you look at the DVD and you wonder why is it a full screen version? Well, why does it seem to be a pan and scan version of the movie? But it's actually the full screen version that they actually cropped the tops and bottoms to release in theaters. And if you look also at the pacing, it feels like basically just a couple of TV episodes tied together. So one of the problems with that is that the animation team, lots of it, for example, the first example with the Alicorn, my best guess is that they looked at the rough designs that they received, and since they couldn't have much of back and forth with the original writers and the original director, because I say original director, they had... It's quite funny because if you look at the credits, they just credit everybody who worked on the season. So you had And so you had the list of directors, and I think they had at least 20 people just directing episodes all on their own. So the back and forth between the studios, since it was done overseas back in the days where internet was not a thing, was quite rough. So my best guess is that they basically did the best they could, and they took lots of assumptions to make it work. Sometimes you'd have more technical mistakes where you'd have, and it's really frustrating because once you see it everywhere. Sometimes because the way that they do the coloring is that they have a cell, they do the Xerox process. They basically take the drawing that they already drew with very thick lines, and they just photocopy it right on the cell. So you get a very, very rather thin black outline that looks kind of sketchy. And the thing is that going with the Xerox process is much cheaper. But then you have to ink it, and the whole idea is that since you're doing it backwards, you're putting the ink on the underside. You can't really do redos, so you're gonna try to do all the colors perfectly. And sometimes you're gonna have the colors just flicker between because one of the color was just placed as a very wrong spot. For example, hair layering weird. Or sometimes you're gonna have one shot with some kind of shadow. The shadow is gonna be layered weird. So sometimes you won't be able to catch it. Sometimes it's gonna be too late. Sometimes you'll have the color flicker because they use paint. And the thing with paint is that you need to get the proper formulation to have the proper color. And sometimes they'll switch between formulations for the same color, and it's gonna be slightly different. Sometimes it's just gonna be the temperature. And also sometimes you'll have just the frames layer. For example, you have a character who's set on two frames, two cells. For example, the body on a specific cell and the head on another specific cell. The whole idea with that is that you can just keep the body still and just have the mouth move on this own cell. It just saves a bunch of time working on that. And the problem is that sometimes you'll have one of the cells just misaligning, or you'll forget a cell for one of the characters. I remember there was one famous one with Transformers where you had the characters just walking and just, I think it was supposed to go inside a rocket. And the problem is that they layered the rocket on the wrong layer, and you could see that you could really see the edge of the animation. It was not supposed to be seen, just because they didn't have any time and they deemed the episode to be like one of the lower priority ones. With G1 MLP, they also had that kind of mistake as well. They just didn't get as much notoriety because G1 MLP is mostly obscure it's mostly just seen as that one thing that people kind of remember, and some people, like, there's Scooter Tricks covering it, but there's not lots of people really actively talking about it, so we don't really get to see all the mistakes that they do. Sometimes they'll have just characters being drawn with the wrong cutie mark, because sometimes it's drawn very small, so because back in the days they drew it on paper, and sometimes they draw it small, and sometimes they sketch it kind of rough because they didn't have much time. So, and sometimes that kind of mistake would happen with that kind of communication issue. And that kind of mistake happens. It's unfortunate, but and one of the things I do realize is that trying to fix those mistakes after the fact it sounds nice, but the whole thing is that I feel like it gives you a good idea when you see the animation errors. It teaches you a lot about how the movie was made, and I think it's quite interesting, and also helps people remember, like, this is a show that's animated. This is not true. This is a work of fiction that's very that has, you look at it and it actually makes you feel like you're going in a different world, but you have to be remembered that this is a fictional world made by artists. And I think it's fine, like, you don't have it might break the immersion for some people, but I think the immersion will be broken mostly if the story is terrible. So I'm not too concerned about that kind of animation error. Unless it's egregious. Like, I don't want a character to just flicker out of existence in front of a frame. That would look horrible. But when you get some characters who blink wrong, or their head breaks for a shot, that's out of your field of view because you don't look at the whole frame at once. Sometimes that happens, but G1 is quite the weird one because It was a really weird show that with a really weird production timeline. For example, the best example I can give is if you look at the comparison of quality of Rescue at Midnight Castle and everything else after, because Rescue at Midnight Castle was produced in 1984. What they had is that they had a 22-minute pilot that they showed on TV, basically to just advertise the brand, and then they realized that they would repackage it later alongside other episodes, and it looks very jarring, partly because some of the characters are gone, although that's less about the animation errors, but that's very jarring, partly just because the animation quality just overall just changed. So, and it's due in part also due to the fact that back in the 80s you had lots of commercial commercial cartoons based to just sell toy lines. So a lot of people just didn't care too much. They saw it more as a paycheck than trying to make something good. And unfortunately, it's quite sad because there's a lot of work, a lot of cells that have had to be painstakingly drawn just to make something that's disposable. So, yeah.
Can you put the explanation slide on again? I want to take a picture of it. I missed it.
Which one?
The G5 face falling off. That one.
Oh, did I pass it? Wait, wait. This one?
No, you were there before.
Oh, okay, face pulling. Yep. Yeah, the one of the problems is that the weirdest part is that, if I recall, this was one of promotional renders that Netflix posted on Twitter. I refuse to call it X. And the question I'm mostly wondering is, did people look at it and because one of the things I'm mostly thinking is, if you squint a bit, it looks like she was hit by a snowball. And if you look at the context, there's snow everywhere. So I do wonder if you just look at a thumbnail, just dragged it, and just assumed that everything would be perfectly fine because it kind of looks like it from that side. I am not entirely sure. So, yeah.
It's like me just seeing things, but now that's me just seeing things. I thought I saw her wing just open, but it's closed right there, but that's actually her wing closed.
Oh, you're probably seeing the wing open that's right behind.
Yeah.
If you just, yeah.
Only the opposite situation.
Oh, actually, I guess I can talk a bit about the technicals. If you look at, do I have a good picture of the? So one of the things that people point out is that it kind of looks weird in terms of colors compared to the way that the movie worked. One of the things that really changed in terms of rendering between the movie and Make Your Mark is the fact that, due to the fact that it's a TV pipeline, they couldn't really afford the kind of global illumination that the movie has. And the whole idea with global illumination is that if you trace a ray, basically you trace a ray from the camera to a point on the ground, that the idea is called stochastic path tracing. You just trace one random ray to another direction. And basically the idea is that you have diffuse reflection, and diffuse reflection is basically just a reflection that just goes in all directions. And then you have specular reflection that just goes in very specific one. And the whole idea is that with a movie, you can afford the rendering time to calculate all the trajectories of light all over the place. So if you have bound lighting from a surface, it will be calculated. If you have reflections, it will be fully calculated. Well, I say fully. Past a certain point, the ray just stops. For example, it might stop after 3 bounces, because past a certain point, the ray is so weak that you don't really notice the difference. But the thing is that for a TV show, you can't really afford to get that kind of calculation, because even if we have now with GPUs that do ray tracing, for example, for video games, what video games do is that they only calculate one path of ray tracing, for example, the shadows. And so what they had to do was to just assume that the rays would just bounce once and that's it. So whenever you see a character, there's lighting. There's a lighting that just passed once for actually cast shadows, but you have environment lighting that's simply baked in. So you had a lighting artist trying to make something that looks a bit more punchy, without having actual proper bouncing lighting. And the best example I can give is if you look at, actually, do we have lights in the? We do not have lights in that one. Shoot. I was basically in the Christmas special. One of the things is that whenever you look at Christmas lights, well, I can't call them Christmas lights, but whenever you see those lights, they had different colors, but those lights wouldn't have any glow on anything else because they had emissive. They were basically, the idea of emissive material is that you give the material a color that will let's say try, but basically just not be affected by other sources. It will, for example, if you have a scene that's completely dark, you still have that color added on top of everything else. But the problem is that with that kind of emissive lighting, the idea is that it's very fake. It just, if you don't have any bounce lighting, it won't actually bounce on other surfaces. So you'll have lights that don't actually emit light. And you had lighting artists basically having to do with the limited rendering budget that they had to make something that kind of looked like proper lights, but you'd have sometimes lights, red and green ones that just don't glow at all. And as part of the limitation of working with that kind of pipeline for a TV series that has probably a decent budget for cheap 3D animated series, but nothing compared to what movies have. And I feel for them. It's quite a lot to be told that you have something great that you could work on, but not having really the budget to pull it off. And yeah, that's why sometimes you'll have eyelashes that clip weird. Yeah.
So you mentioned that for the ray tracing in the movie, there's like 3 bounces that are calculated. Are they still using ray tracing in the show with budget constraints?
In terms of constraint, one of the things I did notice is that they actually have actually proper specular reflections. So whenever you see a shiny object, like for example a crown or a mirror, that's actually properly reflecting your ray. I think they just decided, let's just give one pass for the specular, because getting good specular will help a lot to look more than one diffuse bounce. And I find it quite interesting because, do you remember Philly Fantasia?
No.
Yeah.
You don't? Okay, so back around 2015, there was a show that they announced called Philly Fantasia. It was basically a European animated show that's based on a knockoff of the My Little Pony toys. And I find it very funny because they call them fillies, even though I think they refer to male characters also as fillies. It's really weird. It's very jarring. Apparently, the show is perfectly fine. It's mostly just a kids show that's not that appealing to adults, but it's not like you will die of cringe while watching it. At least not if you look at the reflections, because that show, since they had it was done almost 10 years ago, the limitations that it had were rougher. For example, and the thing that they had for reflection is that instead of properly retracing it, they had just a cube map. And the whole idea with cube maps, you probably look at old video games. Whenever they had something that's supposed to be shiny, the idea is that you simply map a texture of something that kind of looks like what's around it, and you map it in a way where instead of properly turning with the model, it turns counter to the rotation of the model. And the whole idea is that with that, it kind of looks like a reflection, but not. So if you look at that model and it kind of looks shiny, it doesn't actually work like a mirror, so you can't just put a character right next to it and see the reflection of that character, which is quite jarring. And I think for that kind of show, they realize like people won't care too much. It's just a crown that's shining, and maybe if we have one thing that needs proper reflection, we'll actually go with a pass of reflection for that. I remember there was one shot where they had a floor, and I think what they did, instead of actually properly ray tracing that, they just put a camera underneath to just render that view, but at lower res. So you could look at the reflection of the floor, and they did a bit like Super Smash Bros. Melee when you play a Fountain of Dream, the reflection on the floor was actually pixelated, and I found it really jarring because it was something on TV, and I was wondering why did they go with that. And I think the reason why was that was actually a shot for the trailer, so they probably didn't have lots of time to render it. So they probably thought, well, we'll do something that looks a bit fuzzy for the trailer, but it'll be fine once we actually finish it. And I think it took like 3 years to get the whole show done, I think because they had financial problems. Because if you look at the number of logos at the beginning of when the series came out, I think it had like 8 different studios helping. Yep.
Any notable animation error in the 2017 movie or the G movie?
Surprisingly not. I assume because the G4 movie did have, it had a much bigger budget compared to the TV show. I assume that they probably really took their time with the animation. So in terms of animation error, there's sometimes just one character who's having a different cutie mark than expected, and that's it. It's quite interesting. With G5, I didn't really see much that was noteworthy. It's quite interesting, really, to see how different the level of quality control that they have when they actually have the time to work on it. How much it shows. It really shows that it's not that they don't care; it's that they can't afford to care. It's quite interesting to see, really that.
And then for the other movies, I guess, of G4, they have like a bigger budget for those, like it's the 2D ones?
Oh, Rainbow Road Trip?
Well, like the Equestria Girls or like the other ones?
Equestria Girls, I don't really know the budget that they had. I think they're very secretive about it because they did have more budget than the show for sure. But you do see some really weird frames where the anatomy just breaks down because trying to do humans with that kind of aesthetic with Flash. And one of the problems with Flash is that all the pieces, whenever you have a static piece, the kind of transformation you can do is just you have the position, you have the rotation, you have the scale, and you have the skew. And the whole idea with the skew is literally just shearing it on the side, and that's all they could do with a single piece. Unlike what you had with Toon Boom, where you actually have deformers where things can actually bend in different ways. So with human anatomy, it was really weird because you'd have something that felt a bit more like actual puppets or dolls, which it kind of fits because it was literally just made to sell dolls. But the whole thing is that trying to make animation work with that would be a nightmare. So sometimes we'd have to just have pre-drawn hand poses and just flick between them. Some people were speculating that skirts, the fact that all the characters had skirts would be a good way for them to hide, basically just have legs that just float and not have to worry about the layering. They did show later that they could actually make it work with pants. For example, like Flash Entry, he wouldn't wear a skirt unless, I don't know.
And you mentioned the Rainbow Road Trip movie.
Rainbow Road Trip, that was not done by DHX, was done by Boulder. I haven't seen really much in terms of airs. I assume that since it was a small starting studio that that had to prove itself, they probably, I assume they didn't have lots of budget, but they really wanted to make sure to not do too many mistakes, so they had lots and lots of quality control just to work it out. Although I'm not entirely sure with that kind of production. They were very secretive about it. Not many people really talked about it, so I couldn't really say much about it. Also, just Rainbow Road Trip, people kind of just forgot about it, which is kind of a shame because it's not the worst special. It's just that just kind of boring, which happens sometimes. So it's also, I think part of it is also that people were expecting a proper second movie, and I think when they said there is a second, it's 60 minutes, it's going to be on TV. There's a road trip, it's about rainbows, so you put your hopes very high, and turns out it's just mostly a long episode. So that's life. Any other question? How much time do you have? Oh, I have 3 minutes. So do you have any flash questions?
Maybe animation errors in the G5 video game?
Oh, it's quite interesting. What you're going to have sometimes it's technically not a mistake of the animation, but sometimes you have elements just popping in just because the engine needs to feed from the data from the game as it goes. Usually, it's not really big animation errors that really happen. There's since the animation, some of it's mostly just procedurally generated from existing animation. So you'll get elements where you have characters just talking with a default lip sync, and it switches from pose that already exist. Usually, the kind of errors that really happen is mostly just glitches from, for example, the kind of things you see with the speedrunning community. So,
I have not watched the speedrun in that game yet.
yeah. Well, it's about 9 minutes now, so... the game itself was already very short, in part because I think they just wanted something that... because with the amount of voice acting that they had in the game, I think they just wanted something that wasn't too heavy on actually reading. So just doing voice acting for all the game would be quite a nightmare. And also they needed to make something that with the visual quality that they had to achieve, which is quite impressive because if you look at the visuals, the fact that you run a potato, it actually looks pretty decent. I was actually surprised. I was thinking like maybe I'm just the amount of tie-in video games that they have for movies. You know, when you see them, the quality that they have. I was not expecting much, and some of the views that they have is incredible. Like near the end, you have a part where you have the beach and you have a little path where you have to find Babette, one of the crabs, and just the path that you had to just get to find Babette just looked gorgeous, surprisingly. So, and all of that has to render. Like it ran at 30 frames per second, so you have to render one frame of that every 33.3 milliseconds, and they made it work. So you know, I think they did a good job with what they had. So, and I think we're running out of time. So I'm gonna have more panels today. There's in about an hour. There's behind the. Being in the background of animation, where I'm going to be with Justine talking about making backgrounds for movies and TV shows. It's going to be pretty good. There's later tonight, I think at 5, there's 2D versus 3D, the Amazing Digital Battle, where there's a couple of 2D animators and a couple of 3D animators who are going to be talking about the differences between the two. It's going to be hosted by Silverquill. And tomorrow at 10:30, there's a big animation panel on the main stage. We're going to be talking about all sorts of things about animation. I will have a preview for an animation I've been working on for a while. It looks incredible, and I'm really, really looking forward to showing you. So, hope you had fun at the panel, and I'll see you around.